Okay, well, thank you, first of all, for that lovely introduction, and thank you, everyone, for being here tonight and for caring and for coming and listening to my lecture about what Disney didn't tell you and about the original Grimm fairy tales. So in this lecture, you will learn a little bit more about the beginning, specifically my background, where I come from and how I became a fairy tale scholar to begin with. Then we'll dive into the Grimm material, the really dark stuff of the original tales. Then I'll talk a little bit more about the process. How do you go about researching fairy tales? How do you go about publishing? And then a little bit more about the community. And if you have any questions, please, at the end of the talk, you can ask me questions. Feel free to make any comments that you like. Okay, the beginning. So how else can I begin other than once upon a time? In a small German town called Hanau. Now, I like to point out the fact that I was born in Hanau, and so were the brothers Grimm. So this is their birthplace. I hope you can see the pictures okay. It's a lovely town. Maybe the size of Logan, yeah. With lots of Fachwerk, which is the half-timbered houses. And they do have the most delicious cake. It's actually a Brothers Grimm cake, can you believe it? But I grew up in Mülheim am Main, which is about 10 minutes from Hanau, and Mülheim is about half an hour from Frankfurt. Most people know Frankfurt because it has that big airport everyone goes through when they travel to Europe. So Mülheim literally means the home of the mills. We had lots of mills back in the day. Yeah, beautiful town. And I didn't realize it until much later how much I was actually exposed to fairy tales when I grew up. Fairy tales were everywhere. There were fairy tale theater plays, puppetry. I had toys, I had board games, card games. In kindergarten, we did role plays, of course. I watched fairy tales on television, films, and then I listened to so many audio cassette tapes. Everyone who's, I was born in 1980, so we did have these audio tapes. I listened to those, and yeah, just in hindsight, there was a lot of exposure to the Grimm's fairy tales. So that was early on. And then I have to point out that my grandmother read fairy tales to me. Interestingly enough, I asked my mom, did you actually read fairy tales to me when I was little? Because all I can remember was my grandmother, and she had this wonderful storytelling voice. And I think that's a big part of it, right? She had that melodic voice, and as a child, I was fascinated by it. And she told this one fairy tale in particular called The Fisherman and His Wife. And the tale, in a nutshell, is about greed, and that greed has no limits and leads to destruction and nothing. In the tale, there's a poor fisherman and his wife, and they live in a very small shack. And one day he goes out and he catches a flounder. And it turns out to be a magical fish. And he says, if you release me, I'll grant you a wish. And he didn't really wish for anything, but his wife did. So his wife said, oh, you should have wished for a bigger house. So he goes out, calls on the flounder and wishes for a bigger house. And every time the fisherman goes back to his wife, she wants something else. She wants then a palace. She wants to be like a queen. Then she wants to be like an empress. Then she wants to be the Pope. And finally, she wants to be like God. And she ends up in the same old shack that they lived in at the very beginning. So that's this particular tale I remember very fondly. And I often get asked, what is your favorite fairy tale? I mean, it's very hard to choose if you have 200 babies. But this one is one of the shortest tales in the collection. The Star Money. also called the Star Tales. So this is really about selflessness, generosity, and goodness. This is about a little orphaned girl, and she has nothing. She has a bite of bread, or a loaf of bread, something like this, and then she has just the clothes she's wearing. And she goes out into the world and she trusts in God, and sure enough, at every corner there's either an old man asking for something to eat, or there is a small child who's freezing, and she just keeps on giving, even though she has absolutely nothing. And so to the very last shirt, and then she goes into the woods, and it's night, and she's all alone. And she just looks up to the heavens, and the stars start falling down and turning to gold coins. And so she's rewarded with these riches for the rest of her life. And another important thing I think was the fairy tale illustrations that I saw in the picture books that inspired me. And one of my favorite fairy tale illustrator is Edmund Dulac. And here are just some of the pictures that you can see. And then I actually, whenever I send out an email, I have a little, like a footnote, and it goes back to this dialogue from one of the most well-known scholars of fairy tale studies. His name is Jack Zipes. And in his book in 1979, he wrote this dialogue. Once upon a time, the famous physicist Albert Einstein was confronted by an overly concerned woman who sought advice on how to raise her small son to become a successful scientist. In particular, she wanted to know what kinds of books she should read to her son. Fairy tales, Einstein responded without hesitation. Fine, but what else should I read to him after that? The mother asked. More fairy tales, Einstein stated. And after that? Even more fairy tales, replied the great scientist, and he waved his pipe like a wizard pronouncing a happy end to a long adventure. This is a true story, and it happened to Jack Zipes when he was a small boy. I confirmed that with him, and I think it's great. So then I actually went to an international business school after high school, and studied with a business major. And it was something my parents pushed me a little bit to do, because they didn't see that, you know, fairy tales could lead to anything career-wise. And so I ended up studying business. I went to England, to Newcastle upon Tyne, and then I came to the United States. And in 2005, I studied at Georgia College and State University, got my master's in business, teaching business again. And it wasn't really until later at the University of Florida that I was asked by my mentor, so what do you want to focus on in your PhD dissertation? And of course, fairy tales was the first thing that came to mind. Yeah, and then so this led to me coming here to Logan, Utah. And I think maybe one of the reasons why I was hired was this fascination that I had this business background, but then I switched and studied fairy tales. And this combination maybe was interesting to them. Okay, so let me just, okay. Let's dive into the Grimm material and everything that Disney did not tell you. Here is the Grimm material. So, we will talk about the wicked biological mothers, incest, premarital sex, graphic violence, mutilation, cannibalism, child abuse, and anti-Semitism. So you have to know that the Brothers Grimm, they published their first edition in 1812, and it did not sell well. Their project was an academic one. The fairy tales were not meant for children at the very beginning. So in the 1812 edition, the mothers, for the most part, were biological mothers. And it wasn't really until later that they transformed them, that they rewrote them as stepmothers. And that was one of the reasons was they wanted to preserve the ideal image of the mother. So they made these changes also then in the hope that later editions would sell better, because after all, they did need to make some money. So here are some of the most popular fairy tales where they made these changes. And they also, they wanted to appeal to the 19th century sensibilities of motherhood. Yeah, incest. So there is a fairy tale called All Kinds of Fur. And we have a king and a dying wife. And the king promises his wife that he would never take a new bride unless she would be as beautiful as his dying wife. Unfortunately, there was no such woman, he found, except his daughter. And that, of course, was problematic. And the Grimms in later editions added another line that the counselors really told him, this is a sinful act, don't do that. But he insisted. So with some trickery, the daughter finally escaped the clutches of her father. And then there is another fairy tale called The Girl Without Hands. And the father again tries to marry his own daughter. When she refuses, he cuts off her hands and breasts and chases her out of his house. And in all editions of their book, the Grimms, though, recast this father as the devil. Premarital sex. We all know the story of Rapunzel, right? At least the Disney version. Well, in the 1812 version, the prince visits Rapunzel many times. They have a joyous time together. And after a while, Rapunzel notices something. And she actually talks to the witch and says, how come my dress is so tight all of a sudden? And that gives it away, right? So the witch finds out that she has been entertaining the prince. And then later the Grimms changed that to just a slip of the tongue where the Rapunzel says, well, how come you're so much heavier to pull up than the young prince? There's another story where Hans Folly, simply by wishing, impregnates a princess. But the Grimms took this story out and censored that. So they did make a lot of censorship later on in later editions to eliminate any mentioning of sexual innuendos. And then there's the Frog King that probably some of you know. But you might not know that she actually takes the frog and smashes him against the wall in order to break the spell, right? And in the earlier versions, of course, he's then a handsome prince and he spends the night in the princess' bed and marriage doesn't happen until later. Yeah. Okay, let's talk about graphic violence. Well, although the Brothers Grimm toned down the sex in later editions of their work, they actually ramped up the violence. Interesting fact. So we have a fairy tale called The Robber Bridegroom. When some bandits drag a maiden into their underground hideout, force her to drink wine until her heart bursts, rip off her clothes, and then hack her body into pieces. Yeah, and there's also the story of the severed finger that falls into someone's lap. And the Six Swans, we have an evil mother-in-law who's burned at the stake. Very medieval stuff. And the Goose Maid, we have a false bride who's stripped naked and thrown into a barrel filled with nails and dragged through the streets. So I have to say, though, that a lot of times the villains are punished by self-proclaimed punishments, if that makes any sense. So they're being asked before, how would you punish somebody who did this and this, right? And then the villains are usually saying, well, this is what I would do. And they, they kind of announce their own punishment, what happens at the end. And one of the most popular fairy tales, Snow White, right? Remember that scene in Disney when she falls off the cliff? Yeah, the lightning strikes and the dwarves are chasing her. Well, in the Grimm's version, she dies after being forced to dance in red-hot iron shoes. Yeah, I always wondered what would have happened in the Disney version if she wouldn't have fallen down the cliff. I mean, you can see those dwarfs chasing after her with axes and tools. I mean, they would have lynched her for sure. Okay, and so we have in Disney a much more like godly divine punishment. Yeah, mutilation. There's a lot of mutilation and dismemberment, actually. Cinderella. Hands up. Who likes Cinderella? Yeah, that's a popular one, right? So in the Grimm version, it's actually two stepsisters, and they try to fit that foot into the golden slipper, and to make that work, one chops off her toe, and the other one chops off her heel. And the mother says, well, once you're queen, you don't have to walk anymore. Oh, so just do it. And the prince every time thinks he found his true bride, lifts her onto the horse, and they ride by a tree with two doves. And the doves, they say, look at the shoe, it's full of blood. Bring her back and get your true bride. And what I also like in this version, the stepsisters actually go with Cinderella and the prince to church. On the way to church, the doves come and pick out one eye, and on the way out of church, they pick out the other eye. Then we have the juniper tree, and that is an intense one. So the mother, the stepmother, is decapitating a boy, and she tricks him. She says, go and open that chest, there's a lovely apple for you. And as he bends over to look for the apple, she smashes down the lid of the chest and decapitates him. Oh yeah, and later she blames her daughter, that it was her daughter's fault. Then there's the girl without hands. Again, we talked about this. Chopping off the hands and the breast. And then we have, I should use the clicker. Then we have Rumpelstiltskin. I love Rumpelstiltskin. But he is one angry little man in that fairy tale. And so at the end, when the queen guesses his name correctly, he stomps his foot so hard into the ground that he rips himself in two pieces. And then there is a tale called How Some Children Played at Slaughtering. Now I have to say, this tale was taken out of the collection. That was only in the first edition. People thought of it as too violent, even though Wilhelm said, he was really rooting for it. He said, well, when my mom told me, it made me, very careful when playing. Okay. So as you can imagine, there's a pig, and there is one child plays the butcher, and one child plays the cook, and so forth, and then one child ends up cutting the throat of the little brother. But what I like about this tale is the judgment in the end, because the councilmen gather and they're like, okay, how do we judge this? Like, these are children. And then one of the councilmen has an idea, and he goes to the child who killed his brother, and he holds out an apple and a coin, money. And he waits, and the child grabs the apple, laughs, and runs away. And so he is proclaimed guilt-free. And then we have the Fitcher's bird. A sorcerer chops up and pieces together his murderous wives. Oh, cannibalism, yes. So we all know Hansel and Gretel, right? So the witch builds the house of bread and cake and sugar, and then she captures the children and she wants to fatten Hansel up and roast him and eat him. But we don't usually associate Snow White with cannibalism, but really the queen asks the huntsman to kill Snow White and bring back her lungs and liver as proof. And then, of course, he takes pity and kills an animal. And then she takes these organs and has them prepared with salt, and she eats them, believing that it's Snow White's organs. And then again, the juniper tree, what I just told you about, not only does she decapitate her stepson, she also then chops him up into pieces and cooks a black stew, and she serves it to her husband, who eats mouthful after mouthful and really enjoys it. Child abuse. So much of the violence in Grimm's fairy tales is directed at children. In the Red Riding Hood, a girl, of course, is gobbled up by a wolf and then later ripped from its stomach. And Snow White is only 7 years old when the huntsman takes her into the forest with the intention to kill her. Again, juniper tree. Frau Trude is a fairy tale where a witch turns a disobedient girl into a block of wood and tosses her into the fire. And Rapunzel, of course, gets imprisoned in a tower. So I do like a quote by Chesterton, the British writer, and you might have heard of it, and I have to paraphrase. It goes something like this. So fairy tales tell children not only that dragons or monsters exist, but they also tell them that these villains can be beaten, can be there can be triumph. So this is something I want you to keep in mind when you read about this. And actually, talking about reading, there's a very, very short fairy tale I would love to read with you. And if we have a volunteer, maybe, you can read the story of the willful child. And I'll pass on the mic. Do we have a volunteer? Otherwise, I will pick someone. Okay. Oh, yeah.
The Willful Child. Once upon a time, there was a child who was willful and would not do what the mother wished. For this reason, God had no pleasure in the child, and let the child become ill, and no doctor could do the child any good, and in a short time the child lay on the deathbed. When the child had been lowered into the grave, and the earth was spread over the child, all at once the child's arm came out again and stretched upwards, and when they had put it in and spread fresh earth over it, it was all to no purpose, for the arm always came out again. Then the mother herself was obliged to go to the grave and strike the arm with a rod, and when she had done that, it was drawn in, and then at last the child had rest beneath the ground.
Thank you. Thanks. Give it up. Thank you. Yes. Okay. Yeah. So the Brothers Grimm understood their fairy tales also as an educational manual, pedagogically speaking. So, they envisioned if you read this to your child, the child would listen better to the parent. Yeah. And then also, there are several tales about anti-Semitism. You must know, though, that it's a small percentage compared to the 200 tales in total. The Jew in the Brambles, the protagonist happily torments a Jew by forcing him to dance in a thicket of thorns. He also insults the Jew, calling him a dirty dog, among other things. And later on, a judge doubts that a Jew would ever voluntarily give away money. The Jew in the story turns out to be a thief and is hanged. And then there is another tale. In The Good Bargain, a Jewish man is likewise portrayed as a penny-pinching swindler. And during the Third Reich, the Nazis adopted the Grimm's tales for propaganda purposes. Now, this is still a hot topic and part of the scholarly debate about the Grimms, because it seems very contradictory since they had Jewish friends. They were very liberal and open-minded and transparent in what they did and their political views. So it comes a little bit as a surprise that they included these tales. However, you know, to some extent they just wanted to include all of the tales that were told at the time, that were told to them by the folk. So they included these tales. All right, let's talk a little bit about the process. How do I make a career of researching fairy tales? It's simple enough by just finding a topic that really interests me. And then I think about it, I'm like, yeah, that is something that hasn't been researched before, so I should see if I can turn this into something, whether it's a book, a journal article, a book chapter, and so forth. Then I start doing the research, you know, maybe in the archives, or I go online and see what has been done. Very important is that I attend conferences and make connections with other scholars who research something similar, so we have an intellectual conversation about the topic, and I can sort of feel out if it would make a good book or article or chapter. And then I either wait for a call for papers, an invitation to participate in a certain project, or I start a project by myself. And what's interesting is the timing of it all, because really to publish a book, it can take 3 to 4 years, yeah, sometimes longer. A book chapter, maybe 1 to 3 years. Journal article, also 1 to 3 years maybe, then to really get it published. And in the meantime, you can apply for grants to support your research. But yeah, I face several challenges when I do this work. Finding a good publisher is very difficult sometimes. Then you write a proposal or an abstract that hopefully gets accepted. So that's the hard part. And then if you do an edited collection, finding contributors that you can, you know, rely on to deliver the work. And then rejections. So that happens quite a bit, right? And you have to grow a thick skin, so to say, because honestly, it feels like a slap in your face every time you're investing all this time and research. And then, you know, reviewer number 2 doesn't like it. So that's tough sometimes. But, you know, resilience is one of the things fairy tales teach us. So revise and resubmit. And then problematic can be contributors who do not deliver. Issues with the press or any delays, sometimes health issues, sometimes death. All sorts of things. Writer's block can happen, of course, and there's a lot of pressure when you're tenure track, you know, and you're trying to publish as much as possible in a certain time frame, yeah, just to keep in with the timing. Okay, so here's just an overview of some of the books I've published, some of the books so here this one, Craving Supernatural Creatures, is one of my monographs. Some books I co-wrote with colleagues, and Krista Jones is here somewhere, my French colleague. And then edited collections like the Routledge Companion to Media and Fairy Tale Cultures, or journals like Marvels and Tales. So my most recent project that I published together with Krista Jones is the Routledge Companion to Fairy Tales. So this is international. I'm very proud to say that we have 35 essays by 37 national and international fairy tale and folklore scholars. To my knowledge, that's like the biggest international collection ever on fairy tales. So that just came out. And then I have always a few works in the pipeline, so to say. So forthcoming works. Here are just a few examples. My latest one that I just submitted in February is the one here that is actually also published in German by Kassel University Press. And this is about the figure of Rumpelstiltskin and how Jewish authors as well as the far right interpret this figure as Jewish, which is absolute nonsense because Rumpelstiltskin has nothing to do with Jewishness or being Jewish. Yeah. And then I am the editor of Marvels and Tales now, co-editor, I should say. So this is the top journal in North America on fairy tale studies. And we have 2 issues every year that comes out. Publishing about fairy tales, diverse manifestations. Okay, the community. Now this is very important to me personally. Talking about the community, reaching out to the community. I'm a member of several organizations, Folklore Society. I'm also, as you heard in the intro, the co-founder of the Brothers Grimm Society of North America, and now at Utah State, the Brothers Grimm House of North America. So we really want to let everyone know that Disney did not invent the fairy tale, and that they took a lot of material from the Brothers Grimm and just promote them and their lives and work. And they didn't just do fairy tales. They did so much more. They can be really called the founding fathers of Germanic studies. And they also did the first the first German dictionary. So please log on to brothersgrimmsociety.org to find out more. And here are just some pictures of our little Brothers Grimm house. Right now, hopefully we're growing, but we had a big kick-off event the other day, as you can see, at the university. And I'm happy to say we had everyone from first graders to seniors, every age level. We had the Logan High School class perform Sleeping Beauty, and the first graders were in the audience. It was very cute because they really got into it. And we got this wonderful donation of a spinning wheel. And I just reached out to the different departments at the university, and we brought together from the theater department, we brought together costumes and props, and then from the library. So this is one of the things many people don't know. We have at Utah State Library one of the biggest Little Red Riding Hood collections in North America. So I'm like, this should be out there. You know, nobody knows about it. Let's bring it out. And this is just a super small sample of that. And so we had an international table. You know, fairy tales are international, so fairy tales around the world. And this is my Japanese colleague, and we had very immersive fairy tale stations. Thank you so much for your attention, and please feel free to ask anything, to make any statements or comments. And I also would like to point out that we have on Friday here for children another fairy tale event, Little Red Riding Hood themed. So we'll do some fun crafts, and this is for little children from 3:15 to 5:45. If you know anyone interested, and I just put out some books here that you're free to look through, and yeah, ask me any questions if you like.
So I've got a mic. We're going to use a mic. I will run around and hand it to those asking questions. Alan, take it away.
Thanks, Lisa. Who gives grants for this sort of research? I'm used to grants being given by the National Science Foundation or NIH or something. I assume they're not interested in this.
So yeah, we always keep an eye out, whatever we can get. Sometimes it's just other universities, but I mean, specifically for this, we are, since we're such a new organization, we're still looking, we're still trying our best to get some money, but we just got $1,000 from a private donor. So it's not just the big grant places that you can apply to. Sometimes it's also just donations by fairy tale aficionados who want to support this. I'm not kidding when I say that the president of our organization wrote letters to Oprah. So in the hope that Oprah will make this dream come true, she reached out to lots of different places. And we're just looking for that one person who has a big love for fairy tales and who will sponsor us and donate money. And sometimes smaller grants are great too. Yeah.
Earlier in the presentation, you mentioned the process that the Grimm brothers have for kind of like downplaying their sexual content and increasing the violent content. Do you see any parallels with that in like modern media, or is that kind of more of a coincidence?
Yeah, so it's very interesting, and I wrote a lot about modern media and modern adaptations of fairy tales. The thing is, for fairy tales to survive, they have to be constantly retold, reshaped, reimagined in all sorts of ways, right? And we know, they made some really dark horror films, of course, right? Rightfully so. But then also we have more family-friendly shows from Disney, Once Upon a Time, it's called. And this was a great example of retelling fairy tales from a different angle, mashing up fairy tales, like Shrek is a big fairy tale mashup, right? So twisting fairy tales and coming up with ways to subvert the original fairy tales. And some of this can be really dark, but some of this can be funny and hilarious. And you can swap out genders, and you can do so many things with fairy tales. I love this about the genre, because you can really take it in any direction you like. So yeah, as I said, I truly believe, fairy tales are not rigid. You have to play with them and shape them that they appeal to audiences, different audiences across time. And that is, and they speak to us. Otherwise, they wouldn't be around anymore. They speak to us on different levels, right? There must be something in there that speaks to us, so we come back to them again and again and again in so many different ways, and that's why they're still around and they're still fascinating. So we have these universal truths that fairy tales give us. And you might wonder, and it might speak differently to all of you, but what I can say is that fairy tales give us hope, right? They give us hope that in a reality when things are not just, that there is the hope for justice out there. And the Grimms, they studied law. Their father was what you would call a lawyer, or a judge. So they grew up with this mindset. And so justice was very important to them. And with the fairy tales, what we have is this black and white pattern, almost silhouette-like. And then there is the pure goodness and the pure evilness. And, and pure evil needs to be punished. And I get questions sometimes how it is with children. How do children react to that? And I have twin daughters who are 7, turning 8 next week. And of course I read them the fairy tales, and I was very curious, how do they react? How do they react when I read to them Hansel and Gretel? And Gretel pushes the witch in the oven, and they love it. They love it. Yay, right? And it's the underdog. It's Gretel. It's not Hansel. It's not the older brother, right, who had the whole plan with the pebbles and the breadcrumbs through the forest. No, it's little Gretel who's saving her brother in the end. And this is what I like about it. So it's usually the underdog, the outcast, the neglected, the youngest, right, who is the hero or heroine. Yeah.
Did the Grimm brothers ever build upon a tradition of folk tales in Germany that made them appeal to the public wanting to read their work and things?
So the Brothers Grimm, this is very interesting because the Grimm's tales is called the Children and Household Tales. Okay. They did not call their collection German tales because as they were gathering the tales, they found out that these tales are actually not German. They are an amalgamation of different tales coming from different cultures, right? So in the fairy tale tradition, you can go back. Before the Grimm's tales, there were the French tales, right? Charles Perrault and so forth. So a lot of the sources of the Grimm's tales were actually sophisticated, aristocratic young women of Huguenot descent, meaning of French descent, and they knew these tales partially from their French upbringing, and they told them to the Grimms. And as the Grimms, again, collected the tales, they knew about the Italian fairy tale tradition. They made notes, very, very detailed notes, in which other culture, in which other fairy tale tradition, there was a certain motif that popped up. So motif is, okay, I have to explain that maybe. So I always say it's either like a soup, right? And when you ask who invented potato soup, it's like asking who invented fairy tales, right? There are a lot of different ingredients to a potato soup. And it goes, depending upon the culture, what kind of ingredients they put in the soup. And then they stir it and out comes, voila, a new fairy tale. And one of the ingredients of the soup is what we call a motif. And so the motif could be, a mother trying to assassinate her daughter. Something like this, right? So we have these different motifs we work with, and we recognize them. Oh, they show up in this fairy tale, in this fairy tale, in this fairy tale, in these different cultures and different traditions, but it's recognizable. So to give you an example with Cinderella, one of the earliest versions, what we would call now Cinderella, we have a princess who's losing a sandal. And then the sandal is carried by an eagle to a pharaoh and is dropped into the pharaoh's lap. And then he's like, oh, behold this sandal, this beautiful sandal. I want to find the woman who this sandal belongs to, right? So we kind of recognize there is like Cinderella-esque material here. There's this motif of the lost shoe or slipper. But it's not our Cinderella, yeah? And then same thing, like the Grimm Cinderella is different from the Disney Cinderella, which is actually more based on the French Perrault tradition with the pumpkin and so forth. And you might wonder why it's called fairy tales. Because in the Grimm's tales, there's almost no fairies. The German word for fairy tales is Märchen, which, it's like a little story. But the Grimms, as they were collecting the tales, they discovered, wait a minute, this is very similar to this, French fairy tale we've heard. So we have to make some changes. And they got rid of all the fairies and they replaced them with wise women to clearly draw a line between the French tradition and the German. And then some of the fairy tales that they heard, such as Bluebeard or Puss in Boots, they just got rid of it and said, okay, no, we don't take that as part of our collection of fairy tales. It's too much, too close to the French tradition. So yeah. So it's kind of funny that their endeavor was to save, the German essence, the German, spirit of the time with like what they considered authentic German folk tales. But then you discover they weren't really German tales to begin with. And also they edited them so much, especially Wilhelm, that, it's when they say it's from the folk, yeah. So yes, there were some like a soldier who told them stories, or the wife of a tailor, but a lot of these sources were, as I said, aristocratic women, educated women, and they did so much editing to the point where you're like, yeah, they're really still folk tales though. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Great, and while I'm walking to the back of the room, we have a lot of young members of the audience. One thing I want to talk about in research is about everybody asking questions and thinking together. So if any of the young folks in the crowd are coming up with a question, be ready to raise your hand.
Do you know if we have any sort of written record of those original or the tales that the folk were telling, and not just the edited Grimm's or aristocratic versions?
Yeah, so we have to differentiate between what we call folk fairy tales and what is usually referred to as literary fairy tales. So literary fairy tales are those tales that can be ascribed to one specific author at a specific moment in time, that was penned down at one particular time, and we have proof of that, like Charles Perrault I mentioned, right? Or Hans Christian Andersen. Any fans of Hans Christian Andersen here? Right? So this is what we would call literary fairy tales, and yes, of course, we have great evidence, we have that in writing. So it's a little bit more tricky with the folk fairy tales because, as it suggests, these stories were told orally for centuries. So we don't have written records per se, but we have a mix sometimes. So I'm thinking of a tale called The Story of Grandmother, which is like a pre-version of Little Red Riding Hood. And it was written down later, but it dates back to an earlier oral tradition that precedes even probably the French Perrault version. And in that version, we have a lot of cannibalism again. So the grandmother is killed. And when Little Red Riding Hood comes, she has to drink her grandmother's blood and eat her grandmother's flesh. Yes, and then she does a little striptease for the wolf. And the wolf says, "Come to bed with me." And but she's tricky, this one. She uses her wits, and I like this about fairy tales, because she says, I have to relieve myself outside. And first he says, I just do it in bed, he says. No, it's number 2. And then he's like, okay, you can go, but keep this string attached to you so I know where you are. And of course, she runs away and escapes and survives, right? So that is a super early version of Little Red Riding Hood. And Charles Perrault's version is really more of a cautionary tale for the French salon women. And the tale ends with the fact that Little Red Riding Hood gets gobbled up by the wolf. The end. That is it. And he gives out a moralité, a moral at the end. So be aware of, stranger danger, the man out there, and especially the ones that are dressed in elegant clothing.
How would you characterize nursery rhymes?
Nursery rhymes. I wouldn't say fairy tales. I would say that's something completely different from fairy tales. I can't give you a good definition right now, but I would say this is completely outside of fairy tales. Yeah.
I have a question
yeah.
about that kind of connects to your background in business.
Yeah.
And talking about there was this oral history of telling stories, and now they're printing them. And you mentioned also that the original Grimm fairy tales didn't sell well the first time. So can you talk to us a little bit about what the economic piece was here in terms of, did they have to create a market for their fairy tales? Were books a thing that people were clamoring for anyways? And especially because they were framing it as this child's support for families. Can you talk to us a little bit more about that piece?
So the Grimms had a wonderful childhood until their father passed away very early, and they had to start supporting the family financially. It was up to them because they were the oldest. And so that was also the reason why they had to leave Steinau an der Straße and had to move to their aunt in Kassel. And that's why they decided to study law. Yes, it interested them, but it was the profession where they thought they could make most of the money to support their family. So during the time of the Brothers Grimm, it was also the Romantic period. So the German Romanticism was on the rise, and there was a general interest in myth and tales, fairy tales, legends. So that was on the rise. But yeah, as I said, so the first story, the first collection edition of 1812, did I mention there were 7 editions between 1812 and 1857? So did not sell. And they were, of course, bummed about it. And then a translation, though, in England sold really well. And so the difference was, in England, first of all, the English edition had illustrations, which their edition didn't have. So they, very smart, asked their brother Ludwig, there were more brothers, Ludwig Emil Grimm, who was a very talented artist, to actually create some illustrations for their, what is called this small edition, the Kleine Ausgabe of 1825. And so they shifted, and they said, okay, we'll do illustrations. We'll censor everything that is not appropriate or not considered appropriate that people complained about. We changed the image of the mother. We'll, make some more embellishments so the text flows better, and bring it out again. And then, woohoo, success.
Let's do one more question. I'm sure there's one more out there. Anybody?
I've got one if nobody else does.
I think there was.
Oh, we have one. Let's go. One right there.
And I'm still around after this talk, if you want to ask me something.
So we talk about modern fairy tales. What elements does a story need to be a fairy tale? And if you were going to write one, what might that be?
So you have touched on the most difficult question, but that always comes out, what is a fairy tale? And surprise, surprise, scholars until today have different definitions, slightly different definitions, but it's really, because it's so slippery. The fairy tale is such a slippery genre. And it's really hard to nail it down, and some say, oh, it's a story about just a random, period in time, no specific place. But then other writers, they're like, oh, I'm going to write a fairy tale that happened then and then, and they put a date on it. So it's very difficult. I can tell you what, for me, because I had the same questions, of course, when I approached the genre. For me, what is absolutely key is something wondrous happening. Something wondrous, okay? It could be magical, it could be wondrous, but that for me is a key element of the fairy tale. And I mentioned before there's a folk fairy tale, literary fairy tale, and so forth, but something marvelous happening. I mean, the characters are not surprised that, you know, animals start speaking with them. No. But an element of wonder, I would say, is one of the key ingredients. But as you can see, I mean, we read this short tale. Usually fairy tales tend to be short, but then again, if we're talking about a literary fairy tale, it can be super long and complex. I'm sure you've all seen the ballet of the Nutcracker, right? The Mouse King and the Nutcracker. So E.T.A. Hoffmann wrote fairy tales. This also is a fairy tale, considered a fairy tale. And we have tales like, he wrote The Sandman, for instance. We're very dark. So some people call it a fairy tale. Why not? You know, and then we have modern fairy tales that have nothing to do with medieval things happening, right? And then it's not a prince or a princess anymore, but it's a more up-to-date character. So if you want to call it if it's a fairy tale for you, you know, then that's good enough. But yeah, at the heart of it, I would say something marvelous is happening in this story. This is for me one of the key ingredients of what makes a fairy tale a fairy tale. Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that's a wonderful place to kind of end the presentation. What a wonderful thought. And so let's thank Dr. Schwabe again for an outstanding.
Thank you.